Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us at this wonderful conference. My name is Jane Menken. I'm a demographer and professor here and director of the CU Population Center. So this topic is dear to my heart, and I hope we will have a wonderful conversation. We're fortunate enough to have a diverse panel, and I have to thank whoever put this panel together. We have an economist, Kevin Kurek. We have a hardcore demographer specializing in fertility, Leslie Root. We have a policy and public affairs person, Lizzie Shackelford. And we have a protector of the earth, Nalini, oh my goodness, Nadkarni. I wanted to be sure I said that right. So what we're going to do is, first I'm going to read the CU land statement, which many of you, I assume, have heard a number of times in the last few days, and then give each of our panelists 3 minutes to introduce themselves and their views on this topic. Give them some time to question one another and bring up topics for them to address, and then it's over to you. There will be cards, and please write, and if you're a student, big student, students get preference on questions on this topic. Okay? So we're ready. And the land statement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous people in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty, and their work. Educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you once again, and welcome to CWA and today's discussion. We ask that all attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions, signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. Please silence your phones. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We will take your questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and a producer will give you a note card and a pencil. Please print legibly, although having been a professor for umpteen years, any scribble will do, almost. Please print legibly, then raise your hand when you have a completed card, and a producer will collect it and bring it to me. Okay, and before I ask our speakers to introduce themselves, I want to take moderator's privilege, but first I want to tell people there are seats up here if you would like to sit and scattered through the audience. We're sitting here today, right near Norland Library, where the inscription on the facade reads, "Who knows only his own generation remains only a child, always a child." So I wanted to go back in history. We're going to talk about going forward 50 years. Let's go back 50 years. Some of us in this room remember 1975 well. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich, biologist, published The Population Bomb. Several years later, in 1972, the report Limits to Growth appeared. Population hysteria ensued, with all kinds of predictions of all kinds of horrible things that would happen to the Earth and its population if high growth continued. And there were all kinds of projections of the good things that would happen for the economy, for the health of the Earth, if growth slowed or even stopped. The only way to slow or stop population growth is through reducing fertility. No one is advocating increasing mortality, or I hope they are not. So there were discussions at the macro level and at the individual level. Some cared to ask whether having fewer children would improve individuals' lives. Some were only concerned with economic development. Some were concerned only about the Earth. Population policies and family planning programs were introduced. Some were coercive, as in China, and could easily be characterized as violations of human rights, but most were not. The argument over the forces that led to declining fertility continues. Education of women is frequently cited, as well as the family planning programs and policies. And what else continues is the argument over whether fertility decline increased the welfare of individuals and of nations. So if we go back to 1975, the population of the world was approximately 4 billion, and the growth rate, population was increasing at a rate of 1.86%. I don't know how they could be so precise, but 1.85%. By 2025, the growth rate was down to under 1%, 0.85%. The population is at 8.23 billion. Back of the envelope calculation, if the growth rate of 1975 had continued to 2025, the population would be 10.3 billion, 2 billion more than the actual population. The dire predictions haven't come true, and people changed their behavior. And now there are dire predictions about that the low fertility of today will continue and cause population collapse, and the world will encounter serious problems on the way to that collapse. Just the converse of the dire reactions to population increase 50-some years ago. Our panelists are going to talk about positive impacts, positive and negative, of population decline and whether new policies are needed to slow or even, reverse population decline, or even whether great concern over population decline is overblown and misplaced, as was the over-concern about population explosion. So with that, I want to turn to Kevin.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was a wonderful read-in and a great segue. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Kevin Keurig. I work at Middlebury College. I am an economist who thinks about long-run economic growth. And one of the big stories of the past couple of hundred years, as we all know, is that the global size of the population has changed dramatically and in quite an unprecedented rate. If you go back for very long periods of time, the human population was extremely small, and we're living in this brief era of very large human population sizes. And I think the introduction is a wonderful segue because the title of this panel is whether or not low fertility is a crisis or a cure in population decline. And I'm going to do the boring thing and say it's neither. It's neither a crisis nor a cure. And as a bit of a spoiler alert, as the economist on the panel, I think I'll probably end up being the most pro-population. But stating my views that we're in some kind of crisis, I think, does a disservice to the kinds of conversations we should be having about this. And first, and I'm not a demographer, I've come into being interested about demography through the side door of realizing this is an important part of the story of long-run economic growth. So I'm very interested to learn from Leslie about this. But my reading of the evidence is that low fertility on the whole is more an expression of freedom and alternative options that people have today that they didn't have 50, 100, 1,000 years ago. And in that way, it should be celebrated as part of the bundle of progress that comes with modernity. So in that way, I think low fertility is a wonderful thing. Now, I do think that an aging and depopulating world will be less vibrant, less interesting, less materially wealthy than otherwise. But I think to call this a crisis, again, misstates the nature of how long these sorts of things take. And so when there are conversations about how increasing the birth rate can help us with social security problems, for example, I think this very much is just making an arithmetic error. If there were more, if fertility went up overnight, for example, that would be 20 or 30 years where we have more children who are a drag on resources, a drag on time, don't contribute anything. And so if you think you're going to solve the social security problem by having more children, well, you're going to have to wait until, 2055 until we have any inkling that could be coming true. So as somebody who thinks about long-run economic growth and thinks about population size and thinks that larger populations may have their benefits, this would not be on my list of top 10 things if you were interested in raising our economic prospects by even 2050. So the question I think we should be collectively asking is more of a longer term question about what kind of future we want to build that even goes beyond potentially thinking 50 years into the future, just with how long it takes for changes in growth rates to pass through to changes in the size of the population. And when you think about the long term, I think things get a little bit more confusing and, to me, therefore, potentially concerning. Now, again, making predictions about what will the world look like in a century is quite fraught. Oh, I'm at my 3 minutes already. Give me 60 more seconds. I think we could all agree that perpetual below replacement fertility is something that would be its own issue because we would get extremely small population sizes. If we stay below replacement rate indefinitely, below about 2 births per adult female, then the population goes extinct over long enough period of time. I don't think that will happen, but I think we should be thinking about if we want a future that doesn't have population collapse, at some point fertility is going to have to rise. And because it's come with this bundle of progress and modernity, I think this is going to be an interesting question to think about over the longer term. So I'll talk a little bit more about why I think long-run growth teaches us that population may not be such a bad thing. But I'm going to stop myself for now and come back to that later and pass it along to, I believe, Leslie. Is that correct? Leslie or Jane, you can introduce her. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Leslie Root. I'm here at CU as an assistant professor of research. I really like that Jane called me a hardcore demographer. I've never been called that before, but I am indeed a demographer who studies fertility. Thank you, Kevin. That was great. And I think what I'm going to say aligns a lot with that. So I work in the field of fertility, and I study pronatalism a lot and all of these discourses that we're having about how low fertility is and how scary it is. And so my remarks sort of push back on that a bit. So I hope some of you are here because you're skeptical that falling fertility is as big of a crisis as it's being made out to be. I see some nods, yes. There's only 2 things we know for certain about the effects of low fertility. 1, it causes the population to get smaller in the long run. And 2, it causes the age structure to change. So there are proportionally more older people than younger people. Anything else that we know is contingent on both of those 2 things and on the social, economic, and political structures that we're living under. So anything you read about problems that are going to be caused by falling fertility comes with a silent, given that we've arranged society the way that we have. We don't even know that fertility will continue to fall for the next 50 years. This is a point that Jane made, and that Kevin also echoed. That silent given is in there too. And this is something that really frustrates me about the discourse about fertility. Demographers do this, the media does this. You know, we're like, well, we finished the demographic transition, that short period of human history with that explosive growth, and now we're in some state that we're going to be trapped in forever. Do you guys know Francis Fukuyama? Have you heard of him? Okay, so Kevin's like, yeah. Is he a historian, actually? I think he's a historian. But he's famous for, when the Soviet Union fell, saying that it was the end of history, that liberal democracy and capitalism had won, and this is just sort of what we're working with from now on. And a lot of the discourse about fertility sort of does the same thing. But even Francis Fukuyama does not believe in the end of history anymore. He's come out and said, you know, with the stuff that we've seen, you know, with the rise of these sort of neo-fascist movements, with the rise of Trump, it turns out that it was not a decisive victory, right? And there's another aspect to this end of history idea implicit in the discourse about falling fertility, which is that broadly, we're okay with how things are, and we want to keep things the way they are, and in order to do that, we need to turn the fertility tap a little bit. I reject this. I think that a better world is possible, and like with the climate crisis, we can take this turning point, as Kevin said, where we're ending this extraordinary period, and we can use it as an opportunity to think about what a better world would look like. Why aren't women having enough babies? I think part of the answer to that is that people want to do work that is valued, well compensated, either spiritually or monetarily, that puts them in community with others, that they can share that labor with other people, that allows them rest. Not the case with a baby. My kid is 8, but man, I remember those years. And under good working conditions. What would we have to change to make that happen? So people who are skeptical, like me, often say to me that birth rate panics are all about racism, or they're all about nationalism or eugenics, or all about the patriarchal control of women. I don't like to say that it's all about any one of those things, because it's about all of them. The idea of decline gets at deep human fears, right? The fear of death and decay. It's hard to talk about population decline in a way that doesn't sound scary and negative. And how that fear manifests has a lot to do with what else you're afraid of, whether it's a racial other or an immigrant or a woman telling you what to do. So I think that part of how we turned around so fast from the fear of decline that Jane was talking about, or from the fear of growth rather, to the fear of decline, is that decline, or even growth that is slowing down, which I want to emphasize, that's where we are right now. We aren't at population decline, we're at growth that is getting slower. That's true in the US, we still have more births than deaths, I'm almost done, and it's true globally as well. So relatedly, we have this magic number, this 2.1 children per woman, and this idea that if we don't get to that, we're gonna decline. This is a demographic idea. It was invented by a demographer, and it's a benchmark that we use, but it's based on toy populations that have nothing to do with the real world. It's the number of children each woman would need to have if we had no migration, and if mortality was constant, and if there was no heterogeneity in the population. So everyone's behaving the same way, which is not the case. We have different subgroups, different religious groups, education groups, racial ethnic groups that have different fertility rates and different fertility behaviors. And so even if you're at replacement fertility, if you have that kind of heterogeneity, then what's going to happen in the future depends on those subgroups. So I think that we should sit in ambiguity, think of ways to support the people we have with or without growth, because we don't really know what's going to happen. And I can talk about this more later, but focus on the populations that would actually really suffer if there was dramatic population loss, and that ain't us.
Thank you. Lizzie.
All right, I'm right next to the timer, so once it goes, I'm going to be able to see. All right, I'm Lizzie Shackelford. I am a former U.S. diplomat. That's my policy background, and that's kind of what the role I'm playing on this panel here today. I'm also a lecturer at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and I write a foreign affairs column in the Chicago Tribune. So I do tend to look at these things more from a kind of foreign affairs perspective. I am not an economist. I'm glad we have one here. But I will say, in my interest in this topic, I've done a little research, and I have come to realize that even in the 1700s, there was this comprehension of the idea that our Earth can only take so much. And so I'm an alarmist on this front. I'm just going to put it right out there. I think that, as Leslie said, we are worried about this situation because of the way that we have structured our society, and we have structured our society in a way where unless we are growing constantly, we are going to crash. And that was that's been a policy choice of our choice of, the kind of very neoliberal kind of approach to the global economy and national economies and what we judge and assess success on, which is constant growth. To me, again, not an economist, it just feels like a Ponzi scheme. I mean, at the best case, it feels to me like a house of cards, but it really feels like, we are basically kind of, stealing from some to build up some future of a tiny group of people who are going to benefit from this. I mean, factors like the richest 10% on Earth are burning half of the carbon emissions that are causing our climate impact. Factors like that tell us that the way we have created this system that is dependent entirely on constant growth is ultimately going to hurt a lot of people, and it's going to hurt the masses, not the ones who are at the top who get to kind of make a lot of the rules on this. So I think that we really need to just fundamentally change our thinking of what success looks like, of what positive outcomes for the world look like, and it's going to be hard because making major policy changes in a world where governments are ruled by politics is a fundamental kind of mismatch of priorities and outcomes there. Politics is short term. Policy change to address a problem like this is massively long term. As Kevin mentioned, you're not going to see the changes of these policies that we do until I'm long dead. And so it is really hard to get people rallied up to kind of campaign on your great grandchildren are going to thank us. And so I understand the fear there, but as a policy person, I appreciate that we have seen examples of being able to make major changes. If we recognize and prioritize the fact that this planet has a limited carrying capacity, and that at some point, sooner or later, we will recognize that either we will change our focus or it will change it for us. And so honestly, what I look to for hope on this front is the COVID period. And that is because COVID proved to us as a globe that when faced by something massively difficult and challenging that required everybody coordinating all of a sudden all at once to do something big to change how we fundamentally lived, we were able to do it. So I think we can do that. We just need to make those priorities.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. I can go now.
Okay, that's a hard act to follow. Right at 3 minutes. I'm Nalini Nadkarni. I'm a biology professor at the University of Utah. I'm a National Geographic explorer at large, and I'm a forest ecologist, and I study life in the treetop canopies. So I don't have the social science expertise that my colleagues here do, but I do study disturbances in ecological systems and natural systems, and I've developed an approach to understand disturbance and recovery. And I'll just throw out the definition of disturbance as disturbance is the interruption of a settled, known, and stable condition, an interference with what we expect. And so in the long history of human population, this current shift towards declining birth rates is, I think, we can consider a profound disturbance in human population dynamics. And I've developed an approach I use called tapestry thinking to think about disturbance and recovery, weaving together different ways of knowing to understand systems and change that I think might be a good framing for what we're going to be talking about this morning. And as an example, I'll tell you that in the tropics, I study the process of forest fragmentation. When primary forests are turned into pastures, very often there are single trees that remain in these pastures that are isolated from their pollinators and fruit dispersers. So that is a disturbance to them. And I wanted to study this more, and in trying to do so, I realized there was no real theory for relic structures in ecological systems, so I looked to other disciplines to see if they might have theories, other disciplines that are concerned with disturbance and recovery. And in 2014, I convened a colloquium with people who study study disturbances that included experts in burn trauma, in forest engineering, in refugee studies, in neuroscience, in modern dance, and more, to explore how these disciplines deal with disturbances. And from that colloquium, we found 9 precepts that sort of emerged about disturbance and recovery that related to more than one or more of our disciplines. And I'll share with you 3 precepts that came out of that might relate to this topic. One is that it is important to seek knowledge from diverse sources. For example, our traffic engineer uses sources from cell phone data sets, from simulations, from drivers that signal to each other with human communication. So understanding the disturbance of traffic jams requires knowledge from many different sources. The second precept was to enhance the web of relationships. So our anthropologist who studies Karen refugees from Burma noted that these populations maintain their cultural identity through ceremonial dances through the year. So that web of relationship sustains them during their period of assimilation. And third, and I think most intriguing and most important, is that we should anticipate a third state. That is, when we think about disturbance, we think of an original state, a disturbance happens, we're in a disturbed state, and then success means we recover to the original state. But in all of our disciplines, in our discussions in the colloquium, what we found is that nobody returns to that original state, but rather achieves what we started calling a third state, neither the original nor the disturbed, but some new state that would not otherwise have occurred without that disturbance. So, and I'll wrap up quickly here. I think that's what we are trying to do with our panel, is that, and with this conference really, is to, number one, precept, to seek knowledge from diverse sources, just as we are here on the panel, to enhance our web of relationships, just as all of us are here, to contribute to solving problems. And thirdly, what we're doing is trying to understand that third state that we're moving toward.
Thank you. This has been a terrific start. So I'm going to call on each of the panelists, or you can volunteer. But we can start with you, Kevin, since you went first.
Yeah, I think I wanted to respond briefly to something that Leslie said and briefly something that Lizzie had said in their opening remarks, which I just thought all of them were so fantastic and illuminating in terms of understanding where people are coming to from their diverse academic backgrounds on this. And the first thing I'll say is the reason that economists are typically more pro-population than the average person, and especially more pro-population than people in environmental studies, for example, is that we see the world as one in which we are unknowingly friends and allies and collaborators with everybody around the world. So there are people on the other side of the world growing food that I'll eat. There are people working on atmospheric science that are learning things that will make my life better. I have an army of people around the world working on my behalf in this amazing way. And it just turns out when there are more of them, economic outcomes seem to be better. And this is a global phenomenon. So economists do not find it to be a coincidence that the decade in which the human population size is its largest, our current decade, is the one with the lowest rates of global poverty, the highest average material living standards. Children all over the world are taller than they've ever been. So I think that's not necessarily a coincidence if you start to see the human population as one where we are a collection of collaborators trying to together escape the clutches of poverty. So that's fundamentally why when I'm thinking about the long-term future in a very non-alarmist way, I think that a larger population would be on net better than a smaller population. And one quick thing I wanted to say to Lizzie, which will hopefully kick off some conversation as well, is one reason I think we don't need to be so alarmist about this, is to look at countries that are a couple of decades ahead of us on this curve. So we can look at Japan and South Korea, for example. Japan's had quite low fertility for a much longer time than the United States has, and is among some of the lowest in the world. I don't know if anybody's been to Japan recently. It's not a hellscape. It's actually quite a nice place, and people have pretty high material living standards and overall living standards. And so I think, like, if Japan's a couple of decades ahead of us and we think this is going to be some kind of great collapse because our whole system is predicated on growth, it's definitely posed some challenges for them, but it's not, upended things in a way that I think you might be concerned it will. I think maybe my own statements are hoping to poke them on both of those issues. So I guess I'm interested in both the case maybe for more alarmism, and I'm interested to hear both what Nalini and Leslie think about this possibility, this alternative possibility of seeing us all as friends and collaborators, and such that having more of them around might be fundamentally better for us.
Can I respond back to that with a question? So one thing that's come up, and came up especially in Lizzie's remarks, is this idea that we need population growth to sustain the economic system that we have. And in fact, that population growth was what engendered modernity and the Industrial Revolution and all of this. I'm not an economist, but my understanding is that in economics, the relationship between those two kinds of growth is not so clear. And I wonder if you have a brief comment on that. And then sort of the other thing is that it's great to have so many other people working. That's such a beautiful metaphor. And all we hear all the time is that AI is going to take all our jobs and we're not going to need to work anymore. And I mean, I'm skeptical of AI, but sort of how do you see technological progress being able to be a substitute for that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think the background rate of technological progress that we'll see over the next couple of decades is part of the reason that I don't think the future will be worse, even if we see population decline, because I think there's going to be lots of offsetting effects. And again, this is part of what we learned from looking at countries that are a couple of decades ahead of us. I think AI will certainly offset this. And then the question is, considering we'll get this progress, would the world be even better with more people? And I think that's a bit of an open question. And yes, the long-term story of modern economic growth is a complicated one that ties on both a larger population and the fact that falling fertility led to more education. So there are kind of these two parallel channels that are happening at the same time that are now going to come apart. And I think the broad case is that the advent of science and human knowledge and human understanding is something that's been a primary driver of an increase in living standards. I mean, what we know about how to manipulate the world to make our lives better now is remarkable. And a special thing about knowledge is if one person understands something, everybody can learn it from them. And so that's kind of the basic flavor of a larger population. It has more opportunities for people to find solutions, and then we all benefit from those solutions. So this is a bit of a deep fact that isn't contingent necessarily on certain instances. And I'll stop talking now.
All right, I want to make clear my alarm is about continuing to forge ahead on growth. And I think that this kind of hair on fire idea about if we don't manage to continue growing the population, that we are ultimately going to just expand the capacity of what the world can take. But I also find this idea of isn't it better when we have more people and more ideas? I love that concept, and particularly as we stare in the face of AI, I feel like we're going to start losing those contributions, even with or without population growth or decline. I feel like we're going to start losing a lot of that creativity because it's going to get outsourced to little machines. But that is probably a discussion for another panel. I think this concept of no one returns to a third state, I really like that idea, because I don't think what we're going to do is suddenly, have a one-child policy or anything like that, even should we manage to change the concept of what is, a positive economic system. And I think that, we were chatting before the panel began about, the idea of, what do you need to price into the system to better understand how you come up with outcomes that really are more positive, not just for a small number of people whose lives are run by GDP, but for everyone. And maybe a question for Kevin, I'm not sure if you know this, but at some point I feel like with population growth, we've had growing innovation and all sorts of wonderful things, but at a certain point, inequality started growing too. And so we might have continued to have larger and larger global GDP, but more and more people were getting left behind, and the people who were benefiting from it was a smaller and smaller number. And so how does that play into like the population growth? How does population growth, like my thinking is that at some point, that idea that the more and more people we have, the better ideas, the better entrepreneurship, the better everything, at a certain point, you pass into, I don't know if it's the kind of diminishing returns or you've just maximized the capacity of what can be growing on Earth. But those are kind of my questions. And about the third state, what is that third state that would be the most beneficial?
Nalini.
Well, I guess I asked the question first. What is going to be the third state? So I don't know. But I would like to
Nalini,
maybe put a...
May I interrupt for a moment? Are you going to pass out question cards? Thank you.
Thanks. Monteverde in Costa Rica. How many people have been to Costa Rica or visited Monteverde? So this is a cloud forest dominated system, really extensive cloud forests throughout Costa Rica and Latin America for millennia. And in the last century, it's been settled by local Costa Ricans, and more recently, ecotourism has really taken over Monteverde in both positive and negative ways. But down from the mountaintop of Monteverde, where the reserve where I do my research is a little valley called San Luis Valley. And there's a family that's lived there for several generations, the Leiton family. And Maria Leiton is the great-grandmother who has over 1,000 living descendants. 1,000 living descendants. And I know some of her grandchildren, and they were in families of 14 kids. But her great-grandkids and those kids have at most 2 kids in each of their families at this time. And there are all kinds of reasons, social reasons and economic reasons why that is the case. But what it means then is that the population in this area I'm familiar with has precipitously changed its sort of child rearing or child growing behavior in just 2 generations. And the other part of the story is the conservation that goes on in Monteverde. There's a large land piece that has been protected by conservationists called the Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve, protects incredibly important pieces of biodiversity and ecosystem function. And as ecotourism has progressed, more and more of the kids of those grandparents have turned to ecotourism rather than farming. And so there's been this burgeoning of nature in a very positive way. And one of the questions I have for the models that economists and demographers and social scientists use is, does this decline, this projected decline and happening decline in population, how will that affect our natural world? The extent to which we can continue to protect and learn from primary forests, for example, or pristine areas in the hopper, so to speak, as we think about the positive and negative aspects of the third state that's going to be coming from this population decline, and speaking from the standpoint of the trees and the birds and the quetzals and the microorganisms in the soil of primary forests, wondering whether that's considered in your calculations.
Thank you. 1 minute.
Perfect. What I'll say back to that is I think the relationship between population sizes and our sustainability is very, very complicated. And one just quick anecdote to help make that clear is that early human expansion out of Africa seems to have led to the extinction of most of the world's large mammals in every other continent. And so very small groups of humans, if they're not working under the right institutions, can wreak havoc on ecosystems. And so I think first and foremost, the question we should be asking is whether population size has any relationship with the institutions that can protect nature, which is the first order thing we need to figure out. I think a small population can do harm, a big population can be sustainable, and it's a question of politics and making sustainability policy.
Okay. I'd like to interject history once again. The argument that the more people there are, the more good ideas. Has anybody ever been to Florence, Italy, and seen the burst of productivity? I think this goes back, this is an old argument that is a belief system rather than necessarily a something that we have proved. And so the evidence that Kevin, my question for Kevin and for the panel is, if the current economic system of the world depends on population growth, can we change the current economic system in ways, one of you mentioned, increasing inequality? Are there other values, other markers of outcome that we can consider? I go back to the origins of family planning programs and the ideas that having fewer children could be better for families. It was Gary Becker, economist at the University of Chicago, Nobel Prize winner, who talked about the quantity-quality trade-off. And there are, and one of the ideas of why fertility has fallen has been through education, primarily of women, rather than overt there's a whole argument about how much did family planning policies and programs contribute. But we can get back to that. Are there other questions that you have collected? I think we need to turn to you as an audience. And the two that I have now, and this are similar. What about endocrine disrupting chemicals affecting fertility in the US? And someone told me biology is playing a role in population reduction as male sperm counts are declining due to depletion of nutrients in the soil. What do you say?
Can I respond to that? Yeah. You might have something to say too, because you're a biologist. Oh, okay. Yeah, people love to bring this up. It's a topic of huge concern. I would say that the ability to get pregnant is not because of biodisruptors, is not a huge part of this right now. Most of us the world over are having 1, 2, 3 children. We have 30 years in which to do that. If you consider like 15 to 45 as sort of the standard, what demographers use. We're pushing that out. People are having babies at 50 now. But even if your monthly probability of conception is going down a bit because of lower sperm quality or something like that, you're still probably going to manage to have those pregnancies. And the declines that we see are much more about social factors, people choosing to have fewer children, people feeling that having children is out of reach. Those are sort of the two sides of it, right? Is it good? Is it bad? It's a little bit of both. We just had a new birth numbers come out in the US and found that a lot of what's driving it is drops in births to teens and women who are 20 to 24, who it used to be that a very small proportion of those women were in college and finishing their education, and now almost everybody goes to college. And so it's not that they're having sex and not getting pregnant, even though they're trying, it's that they're doing other things with their lives.
Anyone else want to comment? Okay. I have not a single student card up here. You're working on it. You're working on it. Quick. We do want to hear from you. And someone mentioned Al Bartlett, who many of you may know was a CU professor who used to give a talk every year to every group that would listen about the geometric function of population growth. And he is no longer with us, but he was a great supporter of this conference and of the importance of thinking about population. And there have been many examples of both nuanced thinking about population and what I think we all up here would agree is just the unnuance, let me say, of thinking about what's important for Okay. So, we have done that one. You've talked about the economic implications of population decline. You can bring it up. Could you comment on the social aspect? For example, loneliness among the elderly people. It's a huge problem in Spain, and I have read that some older people in Japan are willing to commit a crime that brings them to jail just to be with other people. Well, that seems to be an extreme. Oh, I was supposed to ask you to raise your hand if I was reading your card, so we know who is asking that question. Thank you. Anybody want to address the implications of?
Sure. I mean, I have no data to back this up, so this is purely opinion. But, you know, I think population decline, there's still a lot of people out there. I mean, we're not like missing people. Like, it's not like you're going outside and you're like, there's no one in the parking lot. You know, all the stores are empty. I mean, there are a lot of people on Earth. And so, but I do think it, you know, for very similar reasons, kind of social changes are driving these loneliness epidemics, which are a very, very real thing. That's an incredibly sad story. I hope I never feel like I have to do a crime to be around people. But I do think that the social structures are a big challenge because of changing kind of types of communities. And you do go back historically, and the family unit and the kind of family connections in a lot of cultures around the world is still very strong. And, you know, places that I've lived where I've gone to live is like, you know, my earlier years as a single woman, they're kind of, you know, people like, what are you doing by yourself here? Like, where are your 6 generations on either side that you rely on and depend on? And so a lot of parts of the world, particularly I think the West, we've moved away from those kind of family connections being your number one. And that's a social choice, much like, you know, kind of how many children people are going to have. And I think that it is in some ways a result of a lot of the kind of how much more mobile the West and parts of the world are, which is one of those things. It's fantastic, but then it comes with costs that maybe we need to come up with policies to try to address. Are there policy solutions? Are there ways that we can incentivize more kind of intergenerational friendships and connections and contacts? It's not the kind of thing that's going to be a priority of, you know, the U.S. government, but I think if you look, 2 of us are from the great state of Vermont, and, you know, they do a lot of things to try and address social issues like this, and so there are policy solutions that can help things like that, and it's just a matter of prioritizing them. But I will say, you know, consider your own intergenerational friendships and, you know, try and boost those, just as the little thing we can all do.
And I'll try to address that, putting in a plug for nature, which is one of the reasons that we may be feeling so much isolation from each other, is also our growing isolation from access and engagement with nature. And that when we do engage with nature, we often find social connections that we don't have when we don't. So our world population has, I guess 6 or 7 years ago, is now more in urban spaces than in rural or suburban spaces, and for that reason, and also because we're getting so many more virtual interactions rather than real interactions, both with people as well as nature. So just to build on what you said, I think that it's not just, well, it is policy as well as social sort of drives, which is that if we can find ways to make nature more accessible, especially in urban areas, with pocket parks, with planting trees in parts of the cities in a more equitable way, that those become foci for people to get together, to walk their pets, to interact with each other as well as nature, which we all know has a calming effect, a reduction of stress effect. So that's something that I think local, regional, governments can do, that all of you have the power to influence in terms of saying we need a pocket park here, not just for the benefits of urban heat island dissipation, but so that I can meet my neighbor when I'm walking my dog in a place that feels safe, that encourages less stress and anxiety, and that ameliorates many, many environmental aspects. So a small thing that we might do to counteract exactly that effect.
Interesting. One of the impacts of low fertility, we'll go back to China, has been the change in family structure. And my image once being in Tiananmen Square was of the one child with the 2 parents, the 4 grandparents all looking down on that one child, and then the difficulties of partnerships exacerbated by preferences for boys. So there's a huge social component of the effect. We could talk about the effect of the decline in numbers of children, but it was unequal in many ways. 2 of you have brought up another part of this debate that we haven't really talked about, and that is the variation across the globe. World population growth has been uneven, resulting in a vast increase in migration. Could you raise your hand? Thank you. But there is a negative reaction in many places to migration. How does this fit into more people, more cooperation? And a student says, many developed states in the West turn to migration. Germany comes to mind with their Turkish population. Who asked this question? You. To deal with population decline, there is a backlash to this in the rise of anti-migration sentiments and anti-democratic parties. What does this mean for our democracies?
Okay. As the policy person. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This backlash that is global in many parts of the world against migration is a huge obstacle to trying to find that, that third path that we've been talking about, because there are parts of the world that are not, lacking for labor, and they're not lacking for, kind of an industrial base of people to kind of help build that growth. But the West is, a lot of parts of the world are, parts of Asia are, and they are not particularly welcoming to migrants. And, this is a problem. You look at the current administration here in the United States. On the migration front, obviously that is a challenge. I flew in last night. I was on the little train at the Denver airport looking around at all of the people on the late night shift, kind of, the cleaners coming through and out, and I just had this thought of like, my God, our economy is going to collapse with what's happening, with pushing all of the people out who basically make everything run, because again, how we have built our society. So a lot of policy decisions of this administration and other administrations around the world are very troublesome. The kind of lack of research and kind of really dramatically cutting research and development that can help us find this effective third way to kind of reduce inequality, the attack on migration, but without any solution that they propose for what we're going to do to make up for that massive aspect of our economy. And a third one is basically doing all of this stuff with, while expanding our national debt. And so when you're talking about the policy issues here, it's going to take leadership in places that recognize the population problem that they have to their economy, and find a way to weave that through and highlight and demonstrate the benefits, the huge benefits that probably everybody in here understands that you get from migration in a place that needs that. I would say Spain is really taking the lead in this right now. They have just opened a massive, they basically said, we have a population problem, we have a labor problem, and so we're going to make it really, really easy for people to come here and work. But there's structural ways that it can be done, such as saying, here is the segment of our labor market that we really need to fill. And if you highlight it and you advertise it and you push it politically as, this is a need, here is a solution, I think that you can get around some of that culture war stuff that is really harmful. But we're going to see probably the knock-on effects of this in the next couple of years, and my hope is that that will change some minds politically of the people who have been supporting those types of attacks.
Can I add one thing? Migration is in large part due to inequality, right? Economic inequality, inequality in access to democracy, gender inequality, all of these things. And allowing free migration is a way of ameliorating that, right? And I just wanted to say that I think this is probably part of the third state that Nalini talked about, that we're going to have to get to a point where we accept that these national borders and one state for one people. This is in Europe. This is a big right-wing thing, right? That Germany's for Germans or whatever. We're going to have to get past that in order to care for the people we have. And I think that the question about aging also is related to that, in that the policy solutions are going to probably involve moving people around, not population transfers or anything like that, but thinking about how we structure our living spaces and our urban spaces, and whether a town that people are moving out of, whether how much we should invest in keeping that town alive versus consolidating population and that kind of thing.
Speaking of migration, if you are a migrant yourself or a first-generation American, please raise your hand. This is Colorado, and you would get a very different response in groups in different places. We have huge variation in migration and huge variation in acceptance of migrants and incorporation of migrants. And that's another issue that isn't necessarily, it's partly a numbers issue, but we're getting into questions about the social fabric that really affect all of these issues. Here's a question from a student. Although a larger population may be better for the economy and therefore the country at large, would it not be easier for a country to care for a smaller population? Would the government better serve the people if there were less of them? Who is the? Could you raise your hand? Thank you. Speaking to the idea that more people equal more innovation, are there conversations about how lower fertility may actually instead allow women to contribute more to world building, the kind of innovation we need to redesign our systems? What could this look like? Thank you. And from personal experience, people I've talked with have been very reluctant to have kids due to concerns with affordability and the growing wealth irregularity in the U.S. Do we know to what extent being able to afford having a child has affected the fertility rate? Kevin, can we?
Okay, I'll hop in. Those are three wonderful questions that each could be their own panel probably, so I'll try to be brief. I don't know what to think about whether or not a smaller population would be better governed. I think in some ways a larger population doubles the number of all sorts, or say we double the population, we double the number of all sorts of people, and it's like not obvious which way the balance turns. Maybe local style government where populations are smaller is easier, but I'm really not sure about that. Yes. Wonderful question about the fact that lower fertility helps increase labor force participation rates, and I think that's part of the story for why I think it's completely misguided to think if we somehow increase the birth rate now that this would have some kind of economic boom, because in fact you are just creating a whole bunch of new activities to do that are not necessarily tied to this issue. And the last one, women. Affordability. Yeah, this is an interesting story. I'd be very curious to hear what Leslie has to say about this one. I'll just note that low fertility seems to be a bit of a convergent phenomenon worldwide. So all over the world, many populations are going towards low fertility, and in some places they're not having the same kind of affordability discussions we are. In Japan, housing is notoriously cheap compared to big US cities, and yet fertility is low there. People in Latin America and India are richer than ever, and fertility is falling there. So I find it a little hard to square the convergent phenomenon with an affordability story, but I'm not a demographer, so I'd love to hear what Leslie has to say on this.
Okay, first, I want to say that I think that those first two questions about taking care of the population and about women's labor are really related, because part of the issue with a declining population is that we have set things up such that so the working age population are the people who produce stuff, right? And then we have two other populations. We have the elderly population who aren't working anymore, and we have kids. And we've set it up so that kids are taken care of within the family, privately, and you use your own funds to do that. Oh, this relates to affordability too, actually. With the exception of public schooling, that's kind of the only thing that the government is providing for kids as a whole. Whereas the elderly, we have Social Security and we have Medicare, which is a huge cost. And because of that structure, changing the age structure really changes the fiscal cost of the population. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like it would be, and we'd probably have slightly, not a lot, higher fertility if we gave people more money and more supports to have children. You know, we don't have paid parental leave universally. Finally, we have it in Colorado. We don't have universal daycare. We don't have universal medical care. Like, come on. So that's a big part of that story. And then, wait, what was the third one? Oh, affordability. Yeah. I'm working with some colleagues on something I'm really excited about, which is a fertility intentions and beliefs survey among younger people in the US. We have some of these that are kind of from like 10 or 15 years ago, 20, but we feel like things have changed a lot, and we really want to get at whether affordability or the environment or just not wanting to have kids, what roles those different things are playing, because we don't really know what's going on in Gen Z's brains yet.
Okay. We don't live alone on Earth. There is other life and species. In fact, there is considerable species loss as a result of lost habitat and changing climate. Would the panel address how the consideration of human population should consider the benefits to having other life on Earth? I'll pair that. Whose question was this? The climate question? Thank you. If AI starts replacing humans, should people have more or less reproduction, and why? That's kind of, whose question is that? Okay, let's do climate first. Other species on Earth. Nalini, can we turn this over to you
Well,
first?
I don't think you can turn it over to me, but I have to say when I was put on this panel, not knowing anything, again, about demography or economics or policy, I thought, oh, good, this will be my chance to learn about the effects of a declining population on our beloved high biodiversity areas and so forth, and ecosystem connections that have been so badly threatened and even broken by human activities, especially in areas where population levels are so high. And having been sort of brought up with the Paul Ehrlich population bomb, you know, ever since I was in graduate school, and fearing this, you know, too many people, I guess the first time I kind of heard or became aware of this concept of population decline was basically, you know, breaking out the champagne and saying, hooray, hooray, there are going to be fewer people, and making the connection, I'm saying that's going to be less pressure on land, on forests, on trees, and their associated biodiversity. But that's why I asked the question before, which is whether or not people who deeply think about this with the expertise that they have in demography, economics, and policy, where that fits in and what their predictions are in places where the Western Ghats of India, the hotspots of biodiversity all over the world, what they might expect in the next upcoming decades, especially after we get past this demographic bulge around 2080, in terms of the relaxation or the reduction in terms of human pressures of increasing agriculture, of just people living and changing natural systems into population centers. And again, asking the question, what has been considered there?
Lizzie.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the factors we have to think about when we're considering the impact on the climate, the natural world, you know, species. I mean, if you've looked actually, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's something like horrific that kept me up for several nights of like, we've wiped out like half or more than half of the species of animals on Earth. It's gutting. Like, you don't get that back. I know some people are trying to with like genes and stuff, and that's really crazy, and that scares me, like creating old dinosaurs. But
I agree with you on that, yes.
Yeah, very scary. But so beyond, I don't know, Pet Cemetery versions of that, what we're seeing, sorry, that aged me. What fundamentally, when we look at the growth of the global economy and how it has brought up, you know, so many people out of poverty, and how we are at this mass advanced technological stage, we never have actually calculated and factored in the price of all of the damage we have done to the world over time. And we can't talk about how good and wonderful the global economy is and the great GDP and like levels of poverty, I mean, it's just dishonest to talk about without considering the species, the planets, the health in the air, all of those factors. I mean, I saw an article recently about, kind of the change in Paris's air quality since they started imposing all of these various regulations. Again, we can do things with policy, regulations to make it much more bike friendly and much less car friendly. So there are things that we can do, but I mean, this is a drop in the bucket if you compare it to where we were hundreds of years ago. I mean, the Americas, just the beaver population, for example, a few hundred years ago would just blow your mind in terms of how different our ecosystems were here. And so I think that what we need to do to try and build policies and a general kind of economic approach to the world that is going to ensure that we have a world for our grandchildren to live in the future, we have to find a way to price that into how we value economic growth. And we're not doing it now, and I don't have a specific answer on this. I am not an economist. I'm hoping Kevin comes up with one. But I do think from policy perspectives, until we have another real kind of trauma to the system, something akin to COVID that makes people realize we need to start valuing into into the qualifications of our economy what that price is, what is the value of having clean air, of having these species not go away. I don't think we'll solve it until then, but for better or worse, I think we might be facing that in the next kind of generation.
Can I add to that a little bit? Thanks. So in addition to my being a professor of biology and a National Geographic Explorer at Large, I'm also a research fellow at the Sorensen Impact Institute. A few years ago, that's in the College of Business at University of Utah, and its mission is to grow the world of impact investing. So impact investors are those investors who want to invest their money in programs and activities that do social or ecological good, but also have a financial return. And so I thought, wow, well, that's where money is. Maybe we ecologists who get 2 or 3 year grants from National Geographic or National Science Foundation, when we need to do long-term ecological restoration work, those projects take long periods of time, but we don't get funding from science agencies. So I thought, well, maybe impact investors could be a mechanism to if we could connect impact investors with people who are doing ecological restoration, that would be another pathway for its support. And so now I have my offices in this College of Business. It's like really weird to be around all these business people. Like they have snacks. Like you can get free snacks in the office. But one of the things that we've done is to start what we're calling a nature-based solutions initiative. And one of the things that's going on in impact investing are things like buying and selling carbon sequestration credits, and biodiversity credits are being offered now by municipal and national and international bodies to meet their climate requirements. So there's sort of an economic political pressure to support these, reforestation, for example, in the tropics. And one of the sticking points is exactly what you talked about, which is that we can put economic value on many of these constituents of nature-based solutions, but the area that still remains unvaluable, even though it is so valuable, are what we are calling intangible values. The values of beauty, the values of spirituality, the values of legacy, and the values of the right of a system to exist itself on our planet. And so when I've been approaching and been in meetings, these business meetings with impact investors and holding panels on the intangible values of nature, what they are constantly asking is, but we get it that they're intangible values. We love nature. We get it that those exist, but we don't know how to put a dollar value on it. And when we've worked with bringing indigenous people into those conversations, they say, well, we should not put a dollar value on that, because then it limits it to that $200 a tree, and actually that tree is worth much more than that. So there's this tension and dilemma within the group of people who are trying to grapple with exactly this that I think relates sideways, at least, to this conversation, because of these intangible values that are real, that are uncontested, and yet we have not yet developed the capacity to align them. So the tally sheet, the tally page in deciding what is the value of this piece of high biodiversity land in Costa Rica right now has a big fat 0 where intangible values are, because we can't place anything in that ledger. And so I think that's a real challenge for us to think about collectively about how we move these intangible values into discussions about placing biodiversity and all of the values that come with nature into these discussions that you guys are having about economy, demography, and social science.
Kevin?
Thank you. I'll be very, very brief. I just want to say, personally, the effects of humans on animals is my deepest and biggest uncertainty in all of this. And so I'm not going to sit here and disagree with the panel on this. I think humans do bad things to animals indirectly. I'm also personally quite disturbed by our industrial farming system, and the biggest thing I'm concerned about with a larger population is that we eat more meat as people get richer and there are more of us, and I am working a bit on trying to think through how to bridge economic models with thinking through animal welfare. That's like the other half of what I do besides being pro-people. I'm pro-people and pro-animals, I suppose. But anyway, I just want to say, yeah, this is my biggest uncertainty, the effect of humans on animals.
If there were one policy you could promote for ameliorating the effects of population growth and population decline, where would you stand for the next 10 years?
I wasn't given much time to think about this, but I will sacrifice and go first as the policy person. And I will say, I think dramatically changing our taxation system to tax the costs of all of the inputs on these broader things, on inequality, on our environment, on the free labor that people get. And so I think a more fair, and this is the kind of policy from the U.S. perspective, but from a more fair taxation approach that costs in all of these costs in an honest way.
Leslie? Oh, Kevin, you can.
Okay, I'll hop in. Yeah, I think I don't have a silver bullet policy. I think my broad picture thinking on this is that we should be thinking creatively about how to make parenting easier. And I think that's something we could all broadly get on board with. And my own view is that if that leads to people happily and willingly choosing to have more children, to me, that turns out to be a win-win. I think for others, that seems to be a bit of a tension. But I think, broadly thinking about how to make parenting easier and more pleasant and more widely shared is where my head's at.
Leslie?
Yeah, I was just going to be flippant and say, end billionaires. But that's basically what Lizzie said, right? So I would raise the cap on Social Security taxes and introduce new taxes that pay for some of the stuff that other countries have, that make parenting easier, that take some of that risk and take it away, so that that if you have a kid who has a severe birth defect and needs a heart surgery right away, that you don't have to spend your entire retirement savings on it, right? So both of those things, and billionaires.
Nalini, last word.
I would say that I would require people to spend time in a forest, to look at a tree and to consider what a tree is and what it does, and to aspire to that. A tree's deeply rooted in the ground and stays there. It's connected to the sky. It circulates what it needs, no more, no less than what it needs. It might be very productive in terms of an oak tree, for example, creating 20,000 acorns in its life, but it really only needs one to enter into the next generation. And to gain inspiration from that, so that we might learn to be less materialistic, less looking to others, and looking to the purchase of things that are made from nature, plastic bottles and so forth, to be content, to have the capacity of taking in carbon dioxide, producing oxygen for the rest of the world.
Please thank our panel. This has been an amazing discussion. I hope some of our ideas have changed over the course of the past hour or so. And I want to end by, there is a freshman in the audience who wants your advice, and she may stand and get it. I know you've asked the same question in other sessions. She wants to be Secretary of State sometime. How should she go about getting there? That's as complicated a question as the one we have been addressing. How should we be thinking about population change for the future, and what can we as concerned citizens be doing about that and supporting groups in the future. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to the panelists.